Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your moderator, Steve Clements.
Greetings, everyone. I think I'm at the wrong podium, but I'm going to stay here for a moment. I changed my socks, so I just want to make sure you knew I wasn't exactly the same guy that come in before. We're going to discuss the future of NATO and what will Warsaw deliver in this next session. And our density of ministers and generals is very, very high in this session. Please welcome to the stage I'm going to invite the panel, and then I'm going to invite the Minister of Defense of the Czech Republic to chat with us. But first, please welcome to the stage Witold Waszczykowski, the Foreign Minister of Poland, Lazar Comenescu, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Romania, General Peter Pavel, Chairman of the NATO Military Committee in Brussels, and James Townsend, Deputy Assistant Secretary General of Defense for Eastern Europe, for European and NATO policy at the U.S. Department of Defense. And here to lead us off with some provocations that he's promised will be provocations is His Excellency Martin Stromnicki, Minister of Defense of the Czech Republic. Martin? Have a seat, gentlemen.
I thank you very much for this spectacular introduction. What a strong team, by the way. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I will start opening this interesting panel, The Future of NATO Will Warsaw Deliver, by a remark about words, but I will pass from words to some action as well, I hope. But when we talk about security, defense, about those issues, of course we use words. And very often in politics, words are lacking some content and real meaning and are just slogans. One of these slogans nowadays, a very popular one, is political correctness. It's being hugely criticized, for example, in the Czech Republic, and I would like to explain it a little bit. Because correctness as such is really needed, undoubtedly, and badly needed. We should be absolutely correct. But as I hear it and as I understand it, political correctness, while presenting some solutions to the crisis or the threats we have to face, is rather hypocrisy than political correctness. And hypocrisy is politically very incorrect. Another example, and now I come slowly to the topic. Let's do not isolate Russian Federation. It's tricky because how can you non-isolate someone who systematically isolates himself? Russia regards the West and NATO in particular as its enemy. It's quite obvious and repeatedly expressed. Russians been saying this for many years now. Russian public strategic documents such as the military strategy describe NATO and its enlargement, for example, as a threat to Russia's security. By the way, NATO is very often called a pact. I don't know how it sounds in English, but in Czech, a pact is something suspicious, hostile, strange. Alliance is something positive, something friendly, something constructive. And Russians never hesitate to call NATO pact and never alliance, as, for example, the Czech communists as well. It shows something, maybe. The clear epicenter of tension is now the Baltic Sea region. Here the most exposed NATO countries, in particular the Baltic states and Poland, but also Sweden and Finland, for example, are located. There are all targets of increasing pressure and intimidation from Russia. Threat is usually defined as a combination of intent and capability. This means that for a threat to be real, it needs to be based on both political will to do harm and capacities, both military and non-military, needed for its execution. Today, Russia possesses both, and that's why we must regard it as a threat. Russian rhetorics vis-à-vis Western countries, especially those located around the Baltic Sea, is ever more assertive. Russia is busy testing our defense capacities, our attention, and our resolve in protecting our airspace and maritime space. Russia employs an openly confrontational nuclear messaging, which is stronger than what the Soviet Union was saying in this regard in the 70s and 80s, for example. Russia labels us in its strategic documents as a clear danger. This all unfortunately means that we can by no means rule out Russia's intent to threaten some of the member countries of NATO and the EU, for instance, by employing the hybrid warfare tactiques. Moreover, Russia now qualifies in the second part of the equation as well because it possesses necessary military intelligence and propagandist capabilities to be able to threaten our allies in the Baltic region. After an unconvincing performance of its armed forces during the war with Georgia in 2008, Russia implemented a spectacular and, to a great extent, successful reform of its defense sector, unparalleled anywhere else in Europe. Russians have repeatedly demonstrated their ability to move dozens of thousands of their soldiers at great distances and on a very short notice. Over the past year, they have conducted around 800 military exercises of different magnitude and type in their Western military district alone, which means close to the NATO and EU territory. Most recently, they have proved their ability to deploy forces in a relatively distant place beyond their borders, namely in Syria. A number of our allies in the Baltic region, including Sweden and Finland, have become targets of a strong intelligence and propaganda effort exerted by Russia. Taking into account everything that I have just said, it is clear what the alliance's main task is: increasing its collective defense capacities and boosting the credibility of its deterrence. This must be the single most important item on the agenda of the Warsaw Summit. To preserve our credibility, it is vital that the summit's outcomes in this regard are absolutely clear-cut and explicitly leading to an enhanced NATO defense posture in the East. Sure, in the long-term perspective, we must establish a viable way of communication and communicating with Russia, which is an important actor in European and global security. However, Russia has made a unilateral decision to stop behaving like our partner. We must adjust our collective defense approach to this new reality. A militarily meaningful build-up of alliance defense capacities on its eastern flank must by no means be inhibited by any even informal Russian veto. For the truth is that we will be able to communicate with Russia in a productive manner only once we are sure, and Russia understands it, that our defense is rock solid. I have said at the very beginning that words have their content, and somebody they are empty and lose their meaning. Political correctness, and so on and so forth. And at the very end, I would like to add that Russia certainly should not be isolated, that Russia should be the part of the solutions we need in security field, that Russia should be a partner again. But one thing is certain: the ball is on the Russian court.
very much. Thank you. Before you go, let me ask you one question. When does Czechia come in?
No, it's a media world, you know, simplifications and
I'm in the media.
imprecisions. Yeah, I know, that's why I'm talking about it. No, it's Czechia,
Czechia, excuse me.
La Čeky, Czechian, and so on, in 6 languages, and it's a must to have a short name of
At
any
least for
country.
Twitter.
The Czech Republic in UN, it's too long, you know, to put it on the label, it's too long. Too
Well,
many
we're going to
fonts.
miss you. Thank you. We're going to start with the comments that you made in our next session, and I want to thank you very much for them. I want to also praise you because you do maintain a Twitter feed. It's very interesting, and we'll have to have you back so we can talk about other topics that run in Twitter. So I love those people who have Twitter. You need to work on it. I think, yeah, the general's really great. He's a Twitter star. Anyway, Mr. Minister, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.
Why don't we start our discussion? Let me remind people that, again, the best questions and those that I'll be seeing most quickly will be those that come up for me on the GlobSec app. So feel free to use them. We also have some microphones in the audience, and we're going to turn this into a little bit more casual affair. We have lots of ministers with wonderful names, but we're going to go to a first name basis here, so don't be offended. That's okay with you, right, Vitold? Yeah, it's okay? But why don't we start with the issue of Russia? I'm going to go to my friend Jim and put you on the spot with a provocative question. So Russian fighters in a helicopter buzzed the, I guess it's the USS Donald Cook, came within 75 feet, and we let him go. So does 50 feet or 45 feet would trigger a shoot down? At what point? I'm just interested because we recently had, of course, Turkey, which is a NATO member, shoot down a Russian fighter that entered airspace. We didn't do such here, so I'm just interested in how those decisions are made, what your day was like when the ship was buzzed.
Well, it was 3 days of that ship being buzzed, and it made my day very interesting, particularly the last day. And I think the point is well taken about Turkey versus this kind of situation, in that with Turkey, a Russian aircraft had passed into Turkish airspace, and the Turks did what they said they would do if that happened, and they shot down that aircraft. What's different about the Donald Cook is that we were in international waters. And so in international waters, you would expect to be able to have safe passage. You would expect not to be buzzed and photographed constantly and having the kind of attention paid over a 3-day period. And unfortunately, we were subjected to that in international waters. And so I think as we look at working with Russia, trying to keep things stable up in the Nordic-Baltic area, this kind of unprofessional behavior is just not acceptable.
Do we buzz Russian ships in international waters?
We do not buzz a Russian ship.
Never? Not like in Top Gun or?
No, certainly not. Certainly they were not photographs like we saw of that aircraft buzzing the Donald Cook. I don't think you'll see a U.S. aircraft with that kind of photograph.
Part of the reason that we're meeting today, Vitold, is to talk about how to make the summit in Warsaw that you're going to help host meaningful, to take NATO into its next phase. What would be a flop from your perspective?
Well, we expect decision which change the situation, the status, security of this region. Although we belong to the same one institution, there are 2 different statuses of security in this institution. There is one better one in the western part of Europe, and there is a different status of security on something which is called recently Eastern Flank. There are no troops deployed there, NATO troops. There are no military defensive installation owned together by NATO. So we expect that NATO summit will take care of this situation and change it.
Lazar, what would be a flop from your perspective?
Before trying to answer to your question, perhaps you allow me to make 2 small remarks.
Sure.
Starting from
as long as you answer my question.
Starting from the what was said by our distinguished lead speaker. I fully subscribe to what he said about the need of not isolating Russia, but At the same time, I think it is extremely important to see that it is not about us isolating, it's about self-isolation.
That's what.
So long as the basic principles of the international law and the international relations are disregarded, then one has to be convinced that the one who has to work for eliminating whatever isolationism is Russia. Point number one. And second remark is about the fact that it was mentioned here, the strongest threat comes targeting the Baltic Sea. I would agree with this, definitely. But at the same time, when you look into what has happened in the recent past, we may see that actions taken by Russia, which really not only threatened but changed the balance, they were happening in the south. Starting from 2008, we may remember about Georgia,
I'm going to ask you to speed it up.
and looking into eastern Ukraine, and most importantly, Crimea and the Black Sea. And that means that we have to give the due attention and to take the necessary measures for assuring a balanced adaptation, balanced capability from the alliance to face the challenges where they are coming from. And this is something which we expect from the summit in Warsaw next July.
So drill down a little more deeply for me, both you and Witold, before I go to the general and others. And I've gone to Ian Brzezinski here on purpose because I want you to prepare and tell me from your perspective, you're sort of seen on the hawk side in America, out of league with the current White House. What do you think would be an insufficient summit? So I'm going to come to you in just a moment, but Witold and Lazar, just drill down for a minute. What do you need to see structurally changed? I mean, we hear a lot of words, a lot of platitudes, but what do you need to see concretely achieved in this summit in Warsaw so that it matters?
Presence, once again, presence of military troops from different NATO countries, which can be the symbol, a token of determination to defend the eastern flank. We
At what
need
scale?
also well, we can debate about this, and there is a debate right now about 2 brigades, about some reconnaissance instruments, monitoring systems, but this is a scale we are just discussing in the framework of NATO. But we have to change also philosophy of thinking that for some of our friends, deployment is considered to be a provocation. We feel opposite, that lack of deployment could be a provocative situation for initiating some kind of incidents, military incidents, like we are just having recently on the Baltic Sea.
Lazar?
Fully subscribe to what Witold was saying, just to underline once again that presence, deployment in a balanced way, and also taking into account all the aspects, be it, let's say, terrestrial, aerian, maritime. And by the way, here, the Black Sea region has acquired an extremely high importance from this point of view as well.
Ian, I'm going to jump to you in 30 seconds. What would be an indicator of a really great summit?
Steve, this summit is going to be defined more than any other summit.
Why don't you stand up so the cameras
Since
can see you?
1989, by the here and now. This will not be a summit that will be successful if it's about just building capabilities. It's going to be a summit that's going to be defined by how NATO uses effectively the resources it has on hand. So the 2 questions I would put to your panel is, toward that end, as one thinks about forward deployed forces, what are you going to do to demonstrate that those forces will be able to survive a surprise attack?
Right.
That is a contingency we're dealing with in that region. In terms of the capabilities they have, ISR, air defense, air and missile defense, their ability to reinforce them in rapid time. And then the second, in light of the question you asked about the buzzing of aircraft, Russian snap exercises, shouldn't we also have a summit which delegates authority back to NATO commanders so they can respond in real time to these sorts of provocations, to these snap exercises, to movements that could indicate a sudden surprise attack? That's what we gave them during the Cold War. We delegated authorities to commanders during the Kosovo War. Isn't now the time to do that? Certainly, if not before the Warsaw Summit, at the Warsaw Summit.
So I'm going to jump to Peter and Jim on those, but you think that answering those questions would be key to a summit that mattered?
Those will be key to making summit decisions credible.
Right.
We're headed in that direction.
Peter, why don't you take a stab at Ian Brzezinski's comment, and I do follow your Twitter feed, and one of the things that you outline somewhat beautifully is you praise member nations like Slovakia for what they're doing. You praise Latvia for the role they're playing, in Lithuania in Baltic air patrols, et cetera. And so as you answer this question, I want you to go a little bit deeper as well, if you can. Who are the slackers in NATO? Who's doing well, and who needs to up their game?
Well, I'll start a bit broadly by expressing my expectation that this summit will be more about balances.
Balances?
Yeah, balances, because we need to have a balance not only between deterrence, defense on one side, but also in projection of stability on the other side, partnerships, cooperation. We also need to have a very well-balanced approach to Russia. On one hand, to define clearly where are the red lines, but on the other hand, to be constructive in dialogue. We have to be balanced in terms of how do we assure our defense capabilities, not only and exclusively through forward presence, but also through ready and responsive bulk forces behind, and with all the capabilities which are now not complete, if I say so. And also balance between the eastern and southern challenge, because it's not now only and exclusively about Russia, but we have to deal with serious challenges from the south as well, and we have to prepare proper tools how to react to these challenges as well. And in terms of your question, I hope that it will not be taken as political incorrectness if I don't name the countries, but the countries will be named, hopefully not shamed. And at the summit, current SecGen took a more direct approach in informing all the ministers in every ministerial how do they stand with the defense spending. So every country can see if they are doing well or not, and I will not disclose it here.
You want to tell us who's the top and who's the bottom?
No, I will not, but I'm really glad for what the German Minister of Defense said here, because I think it's for the first time when a minister was so outspoken in terms of proper balance and fair sharing between the US and Europe. And I hope that this vocabulary will make it to Warsaw.
And thank you. And Jim, as you think about what your objectives are as we approach the summit in your role, what do you think are the important needles that need to be moved? And I want you to look back on your long experience. You either started in this game in 1978, 90, or 98, depends on where you cut it.
79.
Yeah, 79, okay. But in that world that you've looked at for so long, what are the anachronisms that are just the dead wood in NATO that have to be jettisoned? I mean, because as I've dug into this and talked to a lot of people here today, there is an interesting, genuine struggle, I think, among people in this room to define a NATO that matters, that's strong and resilient in the future. But there's also just a lot of dead wood. And I'm interested, you probably know the dead wood better than most, so.
Well, it's a great question. And what I would first...
That's usually when they mean it's not such a great question.
I know. It's a great question for me, but not for you.
Yeah.
But actually, it'll be for you, too, because like Sandy Vershbow, our Deputy Secretary General of NATO, who is sitting right there, and Ian as well, we've worked this for a long time, and I will say a lot of what we've done over the past 20 years since the wall came down was to prune NATO in terms of deadwood. So I can give you the good news. As I look around NATO, There's not the kind of deadwood that I think a lot of people assume is there. But there are two factors that we are struggling with. The first one is that we have found ourselves, and this is after many warnings, and I think we all knew that, eyes open, that we were not investing enough in the Allied defenses in terms of ground forces, in terms of ships, in terms of planes. The assumptions we made in the 90s have not proven out, unfortunately, and so we find ourselves absolutely stretched as an alliance in terms of just critical mass of forces to do so many things that NATO's got to do. I mean, the general made a very good point. It's not just what we're facing up in the north, it's in the south as well. It's internal to Europe as well. National forces are being used for counterterrorism missions. Some allies are in Africa. A number of allies are part of the anti-ISIL coalition in the Middle East. The call and requirement for allied forces is tremendous. But we're not able to answer that call because of our neglect over the past 20 years of trying to keep just the critical mass of forces that we might need to handle concurrent operations. And that's what we're struggling with right now. Ian said, what can we do to take best advantage of what we have now? And that's what we're struggling with. We can all increase in defense spending. I think that's going to happen over time. But right now, we have to make the best use of what we got. So that's the first thing. The second thing is in terms of NATO's role and its relevance. You know, NATO has been doing navel gazing since the wall fell down on whether NATO, what does NATO do now?
Right.
We did it through the 90s, we did it into the 2000s. I think right now, this is a time to think about NATO roles because we are facing an unprecedented number and complexity of crises that require tools that we haven't even developed yet. We know NATO's got a role to play fighting ISIL. We know NATO has a tremendous role up in the north handling a Russian contingency. But what about Libya? Is there a role there down in the south? The Italians are making a great effort to try to figure out how can we stabilize Libya. Does NATO have a role to play there? So there is this question not of whether NATO, not of should NATO still be here, but how does NATO adapt itself to handle crises it never thought it would see on its plate?
What is U.S. policy right now? Or do we support establishing permanent NATO bases on the eastern flank?
Well, I don't think NATO has...
Not a quick yes or no to that.
Well, NATO's not looking at establishing bases because NATO doesn't really
Well, I mean,
do
should
bases.
we be looking at establishing permanent bases?
No.
Vitold saying that presence, or bases are what matters.
And
So,
we can have
so from a
presence-
U.S. perspective,
Yep.
do we support it or not support what he's demanding as his measure of success?
We support presence, but we can do it without bases.
All right, let me ask the audience what they think. So pull out your polling device. We're going to take a live poll, and we're going to ask you right now, should NATO establish permanent bases on the eastern border? So that is our question. We have some A, Bs, and Cs. Are they up here? We've got one. You can push one. Eastern allies need NATO bases to feel safer and should ignore Russian concerns. Or two, yes, NATO should establish the bases, but only the national governments that ask for them. And three, no, the bases could provoke Russia to become even more aggressive. So we've got 1, 2, and 3. Please vote now. And I've noticed some of you winking at me, which is great. I've got you. I think, did you wink at me? Yeah. You did, great. Yeah, I hope so. And right here, okay? And we're going to go to some of you, and then we've got some great questions online. And we have, wow, not a single one of you yet has voted for number 1. Eastern allies need NATO bases to feel safer and should ignore Russian concerns. Is that a true result? Yes, NATO should establish the bases, but only if the national governments ask for them. That's a very politically correct answer to that. Would that satisfy you, Vitold?
Yep.
Make you feel secure?
Very
Okay.
much, yes.
And no, the bases could provoke Russia to even more. So we've got 3/4 of the room, essentially, with number 2, and 1/4 of the room in number 3. So that's interesting. So I guess those are the realists, right, Ian, down there, and we'll have to figure out. You voted for 1? Dude, they didn't count you. You're not connected. They know who you are. In any case, I've never seen a 0%. We'll just assume that you're the only one who voted for that, Ian. But yeah, they're saying to me over my earpiece here that you're the only one. Let me jump to a question here. from Pascal Heyman from the Cabinet of the Ministry of Defense in Belgium. I'm going to edit it just a moment, but what is the defining threat to civilization right now? And there may be other answers to this, but he asks Russia or terrorism organizations like ISIS. Because defining the threat, I want to read something that Witold said recently. He says, we have no common definition of threats. We don't know what it is, what these challenges are, and thus we don't know how to defend them. You're very dismissive, Witold, of the notion that there's a shared sense of threat. So let me just go down the aisle real quickly and ask you, what do you think is the defining threat of the day? Would you put Russia in that arena? Would you put ISIS? Would you put something else? I'm going to start with you.
Well, we have, I would define differently. We have existential threats and non-existential threats.
Okay.
And of course, the Russian activity is a kind of an existential threat because this activity may destroy the countries. And we have non-existential threats like terrorists, like a massive wave of migrants who would like to change, for instance, the policy of some countries, but they will not destroy them. The terrorists may do a lot of harm in this or another capital, but of course they will not destroy the whole
So you don't see ISIS as an existential threat?
It is a very important threat, but this is not existential threat for Europe. This activity, ISIS activity, will not destroy European state.
Peter, I'm going to jump to you.
I would say extremism of all kinds, because whoever is in the middle, moderate, usually doesn't fight.
Say that one more time.
That whoever is moderate and in the middle usually doesn't fight.
I see. So extremists on all ends.
Yes, and in that sense, I see even Russian or part of Russian behavior as extremist, because if someone takes part of other country by force and breaking all the rules, it is extremist behavior. So I think all kinds of such a behavior are a threat to our future.
And Lazar, I want to piggyback on this question to you about how you define existential threats. You've been advocating, I know, of missile defense deployment and negotiating that within Romania. As you think about resources and threats, answer the question. So when you think about the defining threat that you matter most, are you matching resources appropriately?
First, I would say that while what Witold was mentioning about the existential threat which derives from the Russian actions, if we are not careful enough, I would say that, and if we look into a longer term and to the risk of powerfully affecting, strongly affecting the architectural structure in Europe, when I see Euroscepticism and all this and dysfunctions in the international, in this, for example, the European Union, because of the terrorism, then I think that that's also something which has to be looked at least potentially also as an existential threat. And coming to...
So if I understand, you're saying the federalism, the inadequacy of decision-making...
No, I would say that the only conclusion which I'm arriving at, looking into all these threats outside Europe,
Right.
There is no alternative to a much stronger Europe. Definitely.
I think we're talking about the symptoms of a greater problem, and that is something that the minister just spoke about in her presentation an hour ago. The problems that we have to deal with that will take a generation to deal with is the poverty and the terrorism and the demographics and the economic issues in Africa, in the Middle East, all the way up to Afghanistan that produce a lot of what we're seeing in Europe, whether it's the migrant problem, whether it's terrorism, the failed states. Those are the big problems we're going to have to deal with. I mean, Russia certainly is there. It is existential, but I think we're kidding ourselves if we feel that today the problems, the risks, the threats that we have to deal with are just those. We have got to mount an effort to get at the root causes of those, and there's no clear solution to do it, and it's going to take a generation, but that's what we've got to do.
Before I jump to this gentleman right here, and then I get to a lot more of you, we have a lot of good time, I just want to push back on that, Jim, and have you explain to me, because I understand the poverty, the disaffection, people feeling this, but, you know, ISIS is really good at black marketing antiquities. That means they have to know somebody who knows what an antiquity is, know how to figure out how to move it in environments that are hostile to it. If you look, one of my acquaintances, who was one of the first journalists who had been beheaded, they were doing this, and I tweeted out a picture and said, "Here is the picture that I would like people to remember, Jim, not the one that they're putting out," and had just a tsunami of ISIS advocates around the world that were agitating me and trying to. So I began asking them. I said, can you guys make a smartphone? Can you tell me about what vision you're bringing? And began trying to sort of engage them. And what's interesting is a lot of them would actually engage. But there's a sophistication that was trained and educated in the West, or trained and educated somewhere, that somehow doesn't fit the poverty explanation. So you have a lot of smart people doing a lot of bad things. So I'm just challenging how you define the terrorism problem, because it looks like there are a lot of smart people that are very Western, very connected, very tuned in. Salah Abdul Salam used to hang out at gay bars and in certain. I mean, there's an element of connection that and interesting how you explain it. It just seems too simple to call it poverty.
Well, there's two layers to it. The layer you're talking about, there are many that are sophisticated and they grew up in the West, educated in the West. And I think what we've got to do as a collective of nations is go after those, as we're doing now, taking away tools like the social media, going about what we do with counterterrorism. I mean, there's ways we can get at that. But the poverty aspect in a country that causes the collapse of a government and creates a vacuum for Boko Haram or these others to fill, child soldiers, the criminality. You mentioned the or others about the smugglers or about antiquity selling or that type of thing. This type of criminality grows in areas that are full of vacuums because the economy has collapsed. Poverty has taken root. There are youth who have nothing else to do. They become smugglers. They're the ones that drive the boats across the Mediterranean. They're the ones that deal in the antiquities. So this criminality is part of it too. And those are allowed to flourish in places where the nation has collapsed. And so that's the problem. We can keep going after the ISIL people who are sophisticated, et cetera, such as you mentioned, and we'll be successful at that. But until we get at where the root of places like Boko Haram or in Yemen, the Houthis, and all the things that are happening in pockets from Afghanistan all the way down, if we can't get at that, then we will be fighting for generations symptoms, worse than ISIL.
Lazar, you had a two-finger?
Yeah, I may add that while it is extremely important to fight the terrorists themselves, I think that in order to, as it was mentioned here by our colleague here, one has to look at the roots of that. And that means looking at who are the suppliers with resources and equipment these people are availing of. And I think that there is an area where there is not yet enough concentration of attention.
I'm really going to go to you, but just one quick question. Should that responsibility be with the governments, or should it be a NATO challenge? Where does the accountability and responsibility?
I think that there should be an unaccumulated and concerted effort.
I see.
That's right. It should be both. And it goes back to your question about the role of NATO. So given this situation, or the European Union, whether it's individual nations, whether it is a coalition of nations, whether it is NATO as an institution, it's got to be all of them. And NATO needs to try to figure out what kind of role does it play, because it wasn't created to do this kind of thing. But this has turned into a genuine security threat. So how does NATO play?
General?
Yeah, Steve, I would like to take on what Jim's saying about a role for NATO, and also what
Take on, like challenge him?
German Minister of Defense was saying. No, I think it's not just a role for NATO. I think what we are missing here is a much more comprehensive approach. Because we have here in Europe two very powerful, very rich organizations, NATO and the EU.
Right.
What they can do for themselves as well as for their neighborhood is to provide the neighborhood with more stability and thus the security. NATO can provide this part of security aspect, but security will not last without any stability and prosperity. So If NATO and EU join their forces and develop packages for every country in the region who is in a position to be a responsive recipient, then we can provide quite a comprehensive package of measures for defense capacity building, for security sectoral reform, where EU is doing a job in many countries, and also providing economic support to countries through the Commission.
Right.
That would make sense in my views.
Thank you. You've been really patient. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and I'm very glad that General Pavel mentioned the EU in this discussion.
And tell us who you are.
I'm Frank O'Donnell, or Francis O'Donnell. I'm from the Irish Institute of International and European Affairs. And some years ago, I represented the UN in Ukraine, but I'd like to take us from the Black Sea, the Baltic, and the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, which is what NATO was all about originally. My country, Ireland, spends 0.5% of GDP on defense. We're not a member of NATO. And depending on the Brexit vote, we might find ourselves with an EU border cutting the island into between two jurisdictions, one of which would be in the EU and out of NATO, and the other would be out of the EU and in NATO. But we have substantial maritime resources and, territorial waters. And I worry much less about the few jihadis from Ireland who go to the Middle East, because we've had our own experience with
So the question for the panel?
My question is, what do you think about Ireland? Are we a weak link in the Atlantic architecture of peace and security?
Here's somebody signing up for the weak link.
Should we be in NATO? Should we be in NATO? What are your views on that?
Yeah.
As a small little...
Let me throw that to General Pavel.
I don't think necessarily that the only guarantee of security is in being in NATO, because we have arrangements with many countries who are not allies, but still who have a great deal of partnership. Some partners are almost allies without Article 5 guarantee, because they have the same level of interoperability, the same procedures. But I think Ireland is doing a great job in EU operations. One of them I witnessed in Chad. And if it works well for Ireland, then it's fine.
Let me ask Witold a moment to come into this, because I did read into a lot of the things that you had said in the past, and you have a reputation for wonderful bluntness. But you said, Spain and Portugal don't see the world like Poland or Slovakia, and they're just natural differences. Are you optimistic that a common thread can be tied between the member states of NATO that begins to sort of matter robustly? I think it's a very interesting comment about being on the edge. Can one side of Europe really feel the pain of another side of Europe sufficiently that you want to pour manpower and resources in?
Well, it's a job for the diplomats and the political leaders to
You're a diplomat.
To convince the others. I'm a running diplomacy. I'm running diplomacy. So that's the job for us, to convince the others. Of course, we have to share, we have to discuss different opinions. We have to acknowledge that there are different definitions of threats, and there are different directions of threats. And there are different answers for these threats. You mentioned about terrorism, you mentioned about a massive wave of migrants. Well, I'm not sure NATO is the right organization to fight these threats. NATO can support some actions, can support some coalitions dealing with these threats, can support some institutions which are directly dealing with the problems of migrants. So I think there is a common ground when we can stay together, we can meet and discuss, and we can find different solutions for different threats.
Let me, Lazar?
Just one small comment drawing upon the question which was raised by our Irish friend, and the comments before and after his question. That puts to the fore, very clearly brings to the fore, how important it is to have a much stronger cooperation, EU-NATO cooperation. And I hope that the summit in Warsaw would result in important steps ahead in this respect as well.
Great. Let me go to my friend right here. Can we toss a mic to her? I can speak loudly. It won't work because there are millions of people watching online right now that want to know what you're about to say. Please stand up.
Yes.
There's lots
And
of...
who are you?
I'm Annalie Gregor. I'm the advisor to the Minister for Defense in Sweden. Lots of threats to handle for NATO, but there's one thing I'm not hearing. There's still a war in Europe, in eastern Ukraine. Is this something that NATO should or could do? Will this be something that will be discussed in Warsaw? Jim?
Jim?
Well, I appreciate the question. I think we've all struggled, whether it's NATO as an institution or the United States and other allies, of how can we help in Ukraine. Ukraine finds itself a close partner in the Partnership for Peace, but they're not in the alliance within Article 5. But NATO has a very close relationship with Ukraine, has been working with Ukraine for years in terms of professionalizing the military, helping the military, and so has the United States and Poland and other nations too. So we do play a role right now, and I think we have now found, up to this point, where there has been so much training effort made, both by NATO, but also by individual nations, that I think the Ukraine force that we're seeing now is much improved than what it was a few years ago, and the equipment there is also much better. So I think there's a feeling that they are better placed now to take on the threat than they were. So I don't think there has to be, speaking personally, there doesn't have to be a new NATO effort or a new US, or we have to keep doing what we're doing, and the Ukrainians have to keep taking on those lessons and improving themselves, acquiring the equipment, and then we're going to have to deal with what Russia did politically. That is something where the EU, where NATO, where the individual nations are going to play a major role, whether it's with sanctions, whether it's keeping the pressure up on Russia to deal with this situation. So as far as I'm concerned, right now the battleground is political, and we cannot afford to let the Ukrainian situation recede to the back as we deal with migrants or immigrants, or we deal with other issues. This has got to stay on the front of NATO's mind, and I think it will at Warsaw.
Witold?
I just want to add that, of course, the Russian-Ukrainian conflict hasn't disappeared from the NATO agenda, and is constantly, we discuss this issue, and we'll discuss before the summit also, because at the end of the month will be a meeting of NATO-Russian Council. That's a NATO institution to deal with Russia, and the major point on the agenda actually is Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Of course, the point is differently defined by Russians. They prefer to define it as a crisis situation in Ukraine. But no, we have to name them directly. This is a Russian-Ukrainian conflict.
Let me go to our app for a moment. There's some really great questions up here. I'm going to go to the anonymous one. Anonymous, they're always the most dangerous questions. It says the biggest threat to our security is neither the Islamic State nor Russia, but internal disunity. Certain governments in Central Europe are currently putting part of what defines our civilization at risk, namely rule of law and freedom of the media. How is that an issue for NATO regarding where the July summit is going to take place? So Witold, it sounds like this is an opportunity for bluntness meets bluntness. So I mean, there are these concerns that what we have seen, we heard the German defense minister today talk about values, and there seems to be greater tension within Europe about what those values are. Are you concerned?
No, I'm not, because there is an ongoing process right now in Poland. We are engaged in a political debate how to solve some problems which were created last year by the former government. According to the Venice Commission, which we hosted a couple months ago, this problem is supposed to be solved in a political way. So political process, political dialogue has just started, was opened by the Speaker of the Polish Parliament, and we hope that in a few months we'll find a solution. So, but this is a subject for the longer discussion for the whole lecture. We have only 40 minutes left, so if you decide to continue, so I can...
Oh no, we have a lot of room, but let me ask you, I wish we had someone from Turkey. I noticed there's some folks from Turkey in the room. I happened to be in Andrew Mellon Auditorium the night that President Erdogan was speaking. It was the anniversary on April 4th, and Peter, you noted this when 12 nations signed I guess the Washington treaty that became NATO, that established NATO. And so the president of Turkey was in the hall on the anniversary of that. And there has been enormous discussion. My president of the United States and vice president go out of their way to be very assuring that they appreciate that the relationship with Turkey is strong and resilient. But there's just no doubt that concerns about treatment of journalists, cartoonists, academics, and others is part of a growing problem. Now, Turkey is not in Europe, but part of the refugee deal is that it reopens discussions with Turkey about possibly getting back on track. So, Lazar, how do you're a famous diplomat negotiator, how do you dance with that?
Well, let's look into how the dialogue, for example, between the European Union and Turkey has evolved in the recent past. And if we look into that, we may find that there are opportunities, there are mechanisms through which things that may be, let's say, questionable at a certain moment, they can be answered. And what I want to say is, the decision, the agreement has been reached to open new chapters of negotiation with Turkey. And if you look into the chapters, into the various benchmarks and then various conditions which have to be fulfilled, then you may find out therein answers in this respect as well.
Jim, quick response? 140 characters or less?
Repeat the question. I want to go at it.
No, I won't. That's okay. It was too long. I'm talking too much anyway. Karsten Fries, are you here, Karsten? Oh, Karsten, cool question. So he asked, the NATO command structure is often pointed to as a rigid, inefficient, and slow to reform. So he says pointed to, but I guess you're really saying, is NATO a rigid, inefficient, and slow to reform rather than just being pointed to? But Jim?
No, I will take on this question for sure.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that question. And I want to take it on because I spent a good part of my life redoing the command structure as recently as just a few years ago. And I will say that it is a tough series of meetings and work to do, and a lot of national interest by nations who don't want to lose the headquarters or that type of thing. We also redid the committee structure at NATO as well. So I think it's important that to dispel ideas out there that NATO, number one, doesn't go and redo the org chart almost every 5 years. I've had more than one SACEUR come up to me and say, Jim, we just implemented all the changes from 5 years ago. Now you're starting it over again. And in fact, we're going to be talking about that, I think, at Warsaw a little bit. But I think I will tell you this about NATO, and I've worked with NATO long enough to see these trends. NATO is adaptable. NATO does adapt. NATO does go about and try to shape itself to take care of the problems at hand. And what we're seeing right now, what we will see at Warsaw, is that adaptation to take on the various threats and crises that surround NATO. And what's different now is they are so many coming all at once in a very complex way, so that it's going to take more than one committee meeting to sit down and try to figure out where does NATO need to reshape itself and adapt itself to handle it. One way is certainly readiness and flexibility, and it's also developing units like the VJTF or the multinational battle groups that we're talking about doing. These are the adaptation, the things we need to do. So we do it, and let's don't do the command structure again.
General?
Just a very brief comment. I agree with what Jim said on the NATO command structure. It may look rigid, but as you said, it takes really 5 years from start to implementation, and we don't want to go through that process once we finished last December. What we can do, however, is to have some kind of functional review and to look at the ways how this structure is working. So we can do internal improvements within the system without restructuring it again. And we have taken a lot of steps, including more flexibility and more authorities to strategic commanders to make some changes within their headquarters and using their resources in a more flexible and efficient way.
Thanks. This gentleman in the back. Yes.
Thank you. Alexander Tedorchuk, I'm representing East European Security Research Initiative. And my question is concerning the Eastern European countries. We are speaking here about the Central European countries. What will happen with Eastern European countries? I mean, this new NATO posture, how this posture could influence on these countries, and could we simply convert into the no man's land between West and Russia? And how do you see all these perspectives for our countries, including Ukraine and other East European countries? Thank you.
So you're talking about Eastern European countries that are not NATO
Yeah,
members?
yeah, yeah.
Yes, so thank you. So about that question that's a very important question about a no man's land. Is this Russia's sphere now? You acquiesce to meddling in others, Moldova and on? So Lazar, Peter?
No, sorry, if I will make a very short comment. When I was talking about projection of stability, about cooperation partnership, it's not meant just about the south, it's also about all other partners, even those to the east. And even Georgia, yeah, and we have a great deal of cooperation with these countries, and of course we'll continue to do so.
Yeah. Lazar?
Well, I think that Peter already answered to a great extent to this question. I would add that only the fact that it is all the more important for NATO, and that once again, I expect that a decision in this respect would result from the Warsaw summit, much stronger engagement of NATO with partner countries.
What policy would you recommend if you saw Moldova begin to look like?
Well, here you have to take into account the options of each of these countries, but as I see, every one of them, they are wishful to, they are wishing to strengthen the relations and to see that through this cooperation, their security is strengthened. So this is something which I consider as extremely important.
Thank you. Yes, right here.
Masaishi, Ambassador of Japan to NATO. It's not my intention to make NATO overstretched. South is big enough, East is big enough. But there are some other issues like a partnership, which is going to be discussed in Warsaw Summit.
Right.
There are partners in Asia, like Japan, Australia, South Korea. So my question is, what would you like to expect? What would you like to see from partners in Asia? And the last question is, what can we expect from NATO?
Well, that's fascinating. Vitold?
Well, I would start answering also the former question, because two institutions we belong to, I mean, European Union and also NATO, they have instruments to answer the challenges, the threats which are for these countries we just mentioned, like Moldova, like Georgia, Ukraine, like Belarus, Armenia, Azerbaijan. And we will continue, of course, using this instrument, maybe a slightly different way, because 3 of them already joined association agreements with European Union. But NATO, of course, will extend partnership, and of course, we definitely will try to advocate and encourage NATO during the NATO summit to keep the doors open, because we will reject any kind of idea of sphere of influence and the right of big powers to have a veto on selecting the alliances. For the answering Japanese ambassador, well, keep staying on the same track you are, and keep monitoring the peace in your part of the world. Of course, with the cooperation with us, because you are doing a great job. So do not change this policy.
Any thoughts, Lazar? Peter?
Yeah, just one word is, in a globalized world, and where you see security challenges in one region or another one, with effects much more beyond, that requires a continuation, not just continuation, but strengthening of the cooperation with partner countries, not only from the neighborhood of NATO, but countries like yours.
Peter?
I think we are not here at the white sheet of paper. We, you know, Ambassador, that we have a great deal of partnership with your country as well as with South Korea. And I would just use as an example that I will come to see your country as well as South Korea and visit the Shangri-La Forum in a very short time.
Jim, any quick thought?
Yeah, real quick one. You know, I look on partners and you see a range of them. I think of Sweden, for instance. Sweden and Finland, who are so close to NATO, do so many things in the Nordic-Baltic region and are very much a part of the deterrence against the Russians that we see now. When I think about Japan, I think a number of points that were made certainly are valid, but there's another point, and that is NATO will find itself in an expeditionary fashion at some point, again, like we were in Afghanistan or in other places, having a Japanese partnership with us, the Japanese nation and the Japanese military working with NATO is critical, as you have done in the past. So for me, looking on Japan, what I would want to see from Japan is a continuing drive towards interoperability and a political forward-leaningness where you take part in NATO activities. This doesn't have to be an operation like Afghanistan, but exercises and training so that you are just as familiar in the hallways of NATO headquarters or in Mons at SHAPE as any other ally. That's what I would love to see.
But that's what they can give you or give NATO. What can they get from NATO? If Japan has a problem in its neighborhood, what can it expect the other way around? So, Peter?
We can see partnership as a really wide range of activities because we have partners with whom we have just political consultation as the minimum, and we have partners with whom we fight. And within that broad spectrum, if there is a mutual interest, then we can develop a specific tailored package for any partner who is interested to work with us.
Great question. Yes, right here.
Stefano Stefanini, Atlantic Council.
Hey.
General Pavel, Jim,
You guys used to work together.
We did.
You mentioned military challenges that NATO allies are facing, anti-ISIS,
Right.
maybe Libya, France in Mali, that are not carried out as NATO. From a military resource-wise command point of view, would we be better off if it was NATO, or NATO doesn't do it because it's counter-terrorism? And then if it is counter-terrorism, doesn't Donald Trump have a point when he says that NATO is not up to the situation because it's not a counter-terrorist organization?
Go ahead, Jim.
You've really described very well the discussions that we're having at NATO in the hallways and elsewhere, because maybe it's thinking about that role for NATO, and it's a role that NATO has not traditionally carried. NATO doing counterterrorism doesn't feel right in some ways, and certainly the old theology within the alliance you would say, well, no, that's done by other nations. But NATO does have a special operations capability. Is that something that NATO might in the future have to do together with other nations, with a coalition? Is there something that, are there other roles that NATO is going to have to find itself doing? And I say that because, as I said earlier, the pool of forces that we have as allies is so shallow now that we are going to have to find ourselves operating in combinations. A coalition with NATO part of that coalition, or NATO operating either by itself or with partners like Japan plugged in. I mean, I think the geometry of how we organize ourselves to take on crises is going to have to be rethought, and we will find NATO doing things that our predecessors would never have thought NATO would do.
Let me just drill down. I mean, I have to drill down because President Obama has said the worst mistake he made, worst decision he made was Libya. And Vitold, you have basically blamed European intervention in causing and triggering the Libyan crisis. And if I understand your question right, there's sort of a freedom to mix. Sometimes you're Europe, sometimes you're NATO. And Vitold, my sense is you think that's too messy, that's a problem, that some European nations can take action and then NATO's left to carry the burden. Am I incorrect in that?
Well, I'm very happy that my opinion was supported by President Obama, because that's what I meant, that some countries started operation in Libya but forgot how to end it. How to finish, how to, after the disorder they made, how to clear and make order. And, well, if Obama noticed my opinion, well, absolutely.
May I add?
Sure, absolutely.
That shows, that's an example of how it goes when one considers and take decision to undertake an action without having established, well, what's the end objective? And I think it's not only the case of Libya that we would necessarily expect.
Let me go to this gentleman.
Yeah, Edward Lucas from SEPA and The Economist. Russia keeps on talking about its nuclear weapons and how it's prepared to use tactical nuclear weapons. And I was wondering whether anyone from the panel thinks that NATO needs to change its messaging on that. We have very few nuclear weapons in Europe, and they're all American, and they're mostly in the Netherlands and places like that rather than the front line. Secondly, do we need a standing defence plan? We had one during the Cold War. We have reinforcement and contingency plans now. We don't have a full defence plan. That might improve our deterrence. And thirdly, do we need to rethink political pre-authorization? The Baltic air policing planes can take off without phoning Brussels. Maybe we need the same for other sort of deployments as well.
That's a big chunk. Peter, you get them.
Yeah, I would say that we discussed it many times, that our narrative needs to take back in consideration nuclear weapons because they are an integral part of deterrence. So we need to remove the seam which was created over the last 2 decades. And not to escalate, but to use a full spectrum which we have available. And in terms of plans, of course, I'm not going to talk about plans concerning nuclear weapons, but they are being considered.
Jim?
Well, it's a great question. What I will say is that in terms of the nuclear aspect, I think the Warsaw Summit, there'll be, as there always is as a summit, there'll be some signaling and some something coming out of in a summit communique talking about the nuclear aspect. There's a lot of work that's being done on that and thinking through that for the past year. And so I think we'll see something on the Warsaw Summit. In terms of plans,
Right.
That's a great point. NATO does have plans, and so does the United States. So I think what's really important as we, the United States, do more and more and more in terms of returning forces back to Europe, that we have to make sure that we, as we do, but we have to really get in tight with NATO in terms of how we think about contingencies and that type of thing, and that's what we'll need to do.
Are we not in tight now?
Well, we are doing a lot of planning, a lot of thinking.
So we're not in tight now.
And we are tight, but we can get tighter.
Okay,
Put it
got,
that
I
way.
just wanted to clarify. Vitold?
Yeah, I would like to refer to the first question raised by Edward Lucas, which is quite important for
Right.
us, the nuclear policy. And I think there is a time to discuss because we used to have a dilemma for the last several years. Actually, in the United States, there was a movement which started some years ago. It was called Getting to Zero, actually to disarm, to get rid of the nuclear weapon. There was no reciprocity from Russia. Of course, there was no answer also from the other countries, nuclear countries. Now, in some countries, also in Poland, the debate is initiated about the nuclear sharing because the threat is growing. So maybe the answer is nuclear sharing. That was just a question mark without the answer. But I think it's time to redefine our nuclear policy in NATO.
Really quick, Jim?
Just to finish the questions that came about over there, in terms of just in terms of planning, we're gonna become tighter, as I said, and I'm happy to talk about those things afterwards if you'd like.
Okay, great. Where's Davila from Lithuania? Is she here? She's not here. She's a young. So put your hand up if you're a young leader, a GlobSec young leader. Are the GlobSec young leaders not in here? Maybe I just made a big faux pas. So they're in another session. Hello, young leaders watching online somewhere. I was going to privilege them over others, so my apologies. Well, let me go to Andrea Bogdanovsky. Bogdanovsky. Is she here? Where? Okay, there you are. My apologies. I did butcher that. We keep hearing about the eastern flank, deterrence and presence. What about NATO's southern flank? Is enlargement still on the table for the Warsaw Summit? Vitold, the south. Good question.
Well, there will be enlargement of the south because Montenegro is going to join NATO. So actually the answer is positive, yes. And we hope that we will continue this debate about enlargement to the south with other countries from the Balkan area. And hope that we will continue discussion with the eastern flank, with how to enlarge this flank in near future.
So the answer is yes. Lazar, agree or disagree?
I agree absolutely, and I simply want to add that promoting the open door policy is a must for NATO.
Right here, lady on the aisle, yes.
Thank you.
My friend, yes.
Hekat Kashilashvili from Georgian Institute for Strategic Studies. I'm glad to hear about the open door policy and the way there has been reaffirmed by the ministers. It's just when it comes to Georgia, an aspirant country who has done itself quite a bit in terms of contributing to the common security of the alliance, I would hope that down the road it becomes more tangible in the way we can see how the decisions have been undertaken previously by the alliance in 2008 at Bucharest Summit will be actually started to be implemented specifically for the accession process to the alliance. So that it does not become a bit of a test case whether or not NATO lives up to the decision that has been already undertaken. Whether it will be MAP or the enlargement process defined directly in that way could be obviously a decision of NATO. And then the question of the deterrence. I understand that when the alliance thinks about deterrence, it's now deterrence within Article 5, the meaning of that will be discussed at the summit. But would you think that possibility of creating a credible deterrence architecture would be possible without engaging in it countries, partner countries, who are at the flanks of the alliance, which are targeted by Russia differently? To the north, that would be Finland and Sweden, and if to the Black Sea area, that would be Georgia and Ukraine. Without them being part of that thinking of deterrence, would there be a credible deterrence architecture? We could become a weak links that would influence any architecture that you could create for the deterrence.
We've got it.
Thank
you. General?
I would only say that to some extent, partnership we have with many countries may serve as a part of deterrence, because when we assist them in building more capable, more responsive defense forces, they become a deterrent themselves. Because when we think back to Ukraine, it was caught by surprise in 2014, and their forces were utterly unready for such an event. So when we assist Ukraine and other countries to be more effective, they will also provide some deterrence.
Right here.
Alexander Dedovic from Alpha Center Nikšić. Montenegro already received an invitation at the end of the last year, but the high level of corruption and lack of rule of law, as well as the public support, are always not measurable. And I would like to ask, how will NATO future partners mark these values in Montenegro, and what will be the role and the political values Montenegro joining to NATO?
Let's leave that to our foreign ministers.
Well, I think
corruption in membership.
As you mentioned, Montenegro is on the way to join NATO. NATO actually, answering quite honestly, does not have such an instrument to deal with the problems you just mentioned. But the NATO countries belonging to other institutions, which is European Union, and the European Union has many instruments to influence Montenegro behavior or other countries' behavior around to behave in a correct way.
Thoughts? Lazar?
Just to say that Witold did the job for me.
Okay, great. Right here.
Thank you. Judy Dempsey, Carnegie Europe. I suppose I should really ask the Polish foreign minister about this. He said he questioned that the mistakes made in Libya. My question is, given what has happened in Iraq and in Afghanistan and Libya, is hard power discredited?
Is hard power discredited? Witold?
No, it's not discredited if it's connected with additional soft instruments, with a stick is connected to the carrots, and in many cases we didn't have enough carrots. In other cases we didn't have enough determination to pose conditions before we start these carrots. We were thinking that, well, we were not obliged to impose our rules of behavior, and that was the problem, that we didn't have determination and enough soft instruments to implement in changing the behavior and the development of these countries.
I should add perhaps that...
go ahead.
There may be the need of a better understanding of the realities on the ground.
Jim?
We've got to develop tools better than what we have to deal with the post-conflict phase. It's not just political will, because you're right. After Libya, I mean, I was part of that too. There was just not the political will to then jump into trying to create a nation in a lot of ways, or at least handle the fallout of the removal of Gaddafi. We were ready to do this because we had gone through Iraq, we were in the middle of Afghanistan, no one had the political will to yet get into another one. But the problem is, not just the political will, but if we haven't developed the tools. I think we are better now than we were in the first part of this century, and when we were in Iraq and that type of thing, and we were building PRTs and this type of thing, we got a better idea of what works and what not. But I think what we've really understood is how complex it is, and every one of those is different. And so what we really need to do is come up with tools that work.
Vito? Just want to add one sentence. It's not my sentence, it's Talleyrand's sentence. There are many things you can do with bayonet, except one. You cannot sit on it. So the forces we have and the instruments we have in NATO are supposed to be implemented, but also supposed to be other instruments provided mostly by other institutions. That's why somebody mentioned already that those two institutions are supposed to work together, and we're supposed to get rid of this kind of a schizophrenic situation that mostly more than 20 countries belong to both of them, but in many cases the same ministers visiting the same capital, Brussels, behave differently in those two different headquarters.
Let me just ask a question, because sometimes when I'm moderating some of these, I ask myself, what should we have discussed so that 10 years from now we look smart? Or what was the blind spot in the discussion? And Minister von der Leyen today talked just briefly about cyber. And when I think about the fact that the US Secretary of Defense is making a giant, giant investment in cyber warfare capacity and in what's going on in the electronic and digital world, what, the fragility of systems out there, and many countries are doing that. It hasn't come up in our discussion at all. And so I'm just interested, is that a blind spot that we're not catching when we think about security, what NATO should be about, what threats are? It just hasn't come up amongst the four of you. Peter?
I wouldn't say so, because when you look at the agenda of Supreme Allied Commander Transformation in Norfolk, they are dealing with all these issues. Not just...
so it's a Brussels issue in terms of the Commission, or,
no, I mean,
or NATO?
NATO is already working for some time on cyber, and together with the EU, there's a great deal of coordination. But when on these other big and long-term issues like big data and the future use of technologies, then ACT is working on these issues. And
you're comfortable, you feel safe about the future? I mean, I read a lot of novels by David Ignatius, and he keeps spinning up these very fantastic stories of, the CIA director's car gets hijacked by a hacker. And you look to science fiction for the future, but you sound like we don't need to worry about that.
No, definitely not. But I'm saying that we are working on it.
I see.
Yeah, we worry, and several years ago, NATO created the cyber center in Estonia. So there are guys sitting there and monitoring situation. Well, how useful they are, I don't know. I cannot evaluate. I cannot say that. But that the problem was already on the horizon of NATO many years ago.
Jim?
If we, going to your original proposition, which is what will make us look smart 10 years from now,
right,
because we started talking about it right now, I think it goes back to this point about soft power and tools, and how do we handle the chaos that we see, whether it's Afghanistan all the way down. We've got to come up with another approach. We can't keep doing what we're doing right now. We've got to organize. We got to rethink how we organize ourselves to tackle those problems. And we've got to come up with ways to do it. It's not foreign assistance. It's not just going into Africa and handing money out or having USAID go off and do a project. It's reached a stage now of chaos out there, described broadly, where we as a transatlantic community have to come in and think about this together. It's not just something the EU can do. I don't think the EU is going to be very good at doing this kind of thing either. So how do we organize ourselves differently, and what are our tools that we can go in and try to handle problems that will take a long time to do? 10 years from now, if we will have done that and we will be on the right road, we'd be looking pretty smart.
So this is totally unscientific, and my puppet string pullers in the back won't be pleased, but quick show of hands. How many of you think cyber is an important topic, sort of a blind spot in the discussion so far today? Put up your hands if you think it's neglected too much. Interesting. Okay. How many of you think it's not something we ought to worry about right now, or that we're dealing with it okay? Be brave. There we go. I like this gentleman at the back. And well, no, there were two actually. And let me ask, and on soft power, thinking through the contours of that, how many of you think that needs more definitional scope and discussion? Put your hands up. Fascinating. So about half the room. Interesting. So there's interesting sort of charts for how you think of it here. This gentleman right here.
Jonathan Isle, Royal United Services Institute, UK. Still part of the European Union.
What are you betting? Where's your bet going?
I think my question is directed at Mr.
Just ignored that.
Which is, it's the second time since the Munich conference was the first time, and now in GlobSec, that we hear Romanians in particular talking about the southern flank of NATO being perhaps a bit ignored. I take it. But wouldn't you say that the real problem is not so much that there is a lack of attention in Brussels, but that the fact that the southern flank is so dysfunctional by its existing member states? Namely, what exactly needs to be done in the Black Sea, for instance, that could be done with the support and the agreement of the Turks that is not being done by NATO at the moment?
So dysfunctionality of the South. So where are we on that? Lazar?
Well,
use your soccer voice. Be
to
loud.
try to answer, yes, Jonathan. As I said, when I underline the fact that the southern flank, well, the southern part of the eastern flank is better to say, deserves to be paid greater attention. I having had in mind what Russia has been doing. And there we see that all the acts which do represent a factor of threat to the security and stability for all of us, they have been produced there. And it is in this vein that I was speaking about the necessity to concentrate, to give increased attention to this part of the eastern flank. Doesn't mean that we are not aware of the fact that all the eastern flank is extremely important for the alliance as a whole. And every efforts have to be concentrated to strengthen the capabilities of NATO in terms of deterrence, capabilities, and so on, to face the challenges which are coming from that part of the neighborhood of the alliance. Now, what if the countries like Romania, I will limit to comment about Romania. And well, I'm waiting for the summit in NATO to confirm, to declare the operational capability of the ballistic missile system. But beyond that, I think that Romania is one of the few countries which committed to increase the budget for defense. And it's a commitment by all the Romanian political class and government as authorities. So 10 years starting from next year, Romania would allocate 2% at least to defense, as a contribution also to the strengthening of the capabilities of all the alliance.
Okay, quick thought. We're in lightning round. 5 minutes left. Any response on dysfunctionality in the South?
Well, I'm far away from the Black Sea, so I have to concentrate on the Baltic Sea and increase security in this area. But of course, we share the opinion of our Romanian friends that the eastern flank is not related only to the Baltic area. There are also Black Sea issues which are supposed to be discussed, and I hope that, that we find a proper answer during the Warsaw summit. According to RAND Corporation report, the eastern flank is supposed to be defended by at least 7 divisions. 7 divisions. We have 3 of them in Poland, our own. We need 4 more.
So this is giving us a very good picture of what at least the debate points will be in Warsaw. Let me go to the app here for a moment, and there's a great, what I would call sort of an editorially tense question. I love it. But where's Francis O'Donnell? Francis, Oh, you already had, didn't, well, I didn't listen. Well, you get second chance about it. What is the best response to the Russian grievance that the West promised no eastward NATO expansion after the end of the Cold War? Jim, I'm going to put that on you.
I don't know where that has come from.
There wasn't such a
I've
promise.
heard this, you know, there was no promise
It
that
came
I
from
know
him.
of.
Yeah.
I mean, what's that?
I said it was his question.
Yeah, I know, but it's the second time
I
I've
just wanna
heard
put-
that there was a promise made to Russia about that had to do with the expansion of NATO. There was the NATO-Russia Founding Act. We know what that's about. It's not even deserving of a comment right now. And there were other aspects of NATO's relationship with Russia, but there was never a promise made to them that I know of that had to do that shaped the NATO forces and what they may or may not do. I mean, there was the NATO-Russia Founding Act, and I don't think there was anything else. So I think that comes out of Moscow. I have no idea what
There was
that
no
is.
second.
Well,
Yalta.
Richard
There
Haas
was no
has
second
said,
Yalta.
while he hasn't said this, he's said that when he was responsible, he wrote a white paper about creating a bridge for eventual NATO membership of Russia. So part of this was dealing with the question at that time of where Russia would lie in the future, one way or another. So there was at least some acknowledgement by Richard Haas of that.
But it sounds like it's dealing with something else. I think this is a bit of propaganda being spun, quite frankly. Again, trying to confuse things with the NATO-Russia Founding Act. Putting that aside, there was nothing else. There was nothing else. There was no promise made. There was no secret deal. That's just crazy. It's propaganda.
We're using this as our wrap-up comments, guys, so as we go through it, if you have a zinger that you didn't raise during this, as you answer this question on Russia, feel free. But General Pavel?
I would just say that such an agreement would be against the UN Charter, because UN Charter gives the right to every nation and to self-determination, and it's up to a nation to decide where they want to belong. So I really think that there is no question about NATO enlargement as being perceived as an act of aggressive behavior towards Russia. If Russia was attractive enough, probably these nations would be interested to join Russia instead of NATO.
Foreign Minister Kamenescu.
Well, I simply want to remember that, and I fully subscribe to the idea of kind of a propaganda. Because if I'm not mistaken, when in 1997, when the Russia-NATO Founding Act has been negotiated and adopted, it was when, after they knew about the fact that already some of the countries in the Central and Eastern Europe will become members of NATO. The decision was taken in Madrid.
And quick wrap-up, Foreign Minister Wojciechowski.
Well, we have a Latin saying that historia is magistra vitae, history is the teacher. And it teaches us that we shouldn't repeat mistakes from the past. There was no new Yalta after the end of the Cold War. And there will be no Yalta right now, either in Warsaw or during the next summit. We are not going to accept the sphere of influence. We are not going to come back to the 19th century concept of powers, balance of powers. We are trying to build democratic world from Vancouver to Vladivostok.
This has been a high-octane chat. All of you, thank you so much for what you've done to help bring such great thought and thinking and questions to this. I had a lot of fun. Before we really thank everyone, let me mention that this concludes today's main sessions at GlobSec 2016. But don't forget the Night Owl sessions, off-the-record talks this evening, and also the final City Talks debate of the day at the L+S studio in central Bratislava. That starts at 6:45. The first session is here tomorrow at 9 a.m. sharp with His Excellency Nasser Judeh, Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Jordan. If you see the young GlobSec leaders, give them a hug. Tell them they were remembered here, that we thought we were, looking for questions, because they're all around and very important. But again, a big round of applause for Witold Waszczykowski, Lazar Kamenescu, General Peter Pavel, and James Townsend. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well,